Lanny and I talked about doing this talk. He and I have served on some AVMA committees together, and the more I started putting the talk together kind of at the last minute, I realized I probably should have had Lisa Becton or Patrick Webb or some of the people who are more involved in the animal health side of our surveillance efforts up here instead of me, but I have this problem putting my mouth in a circle and saying no. So here I am. And luckily we have Lisa in the back of the room. We're going to talk some about our comprehensive surveillance that we started working on several years ago, and Dr. Schmidt from Iowa has been involved in some of those meetings, and we have our USDA folks in the back with Troy and Ellen. So when I get off topic or off track, those are my experts, and I'm counting on them to get me out of trouble. So here's a little bit about what we're going to cover. We're going to look at kind of what we've done historically on an integrated surveillance system for swine diseases, and then touch a little bit on what, with slides I've borrowed or gotten from USDA on their current thinking on comprehensive swine surveillance. And then the reason we're putting these two talks together is that coming from the pork industry, we really feel that the influenza surveillance needs to be one part of a comprehensive and integrated program. So talking about swine surveillance separately is just kind of counter to keeping a comprehensive and integrated system. I will give you a little history on what we did prior to 2009, and then a little bit about what happened since 2009, and then kind of next steps of where we'd like to go to continue down the path to a comprehensive influenza plan. So if you look at integrated swine surveillance, these slides actually were written after a meeting that we held in 2007. And the objective of what we see as an integrated swine disease surveillance program is to use the expertise and experience of a variety of sources to develop and maintain effective integrated swine disease surveillance system. And we need to do things like address freedom from disease and address detection of disease, largely for trade issues. We are now exporting somewhere over 20% of pork. It becomes a big issue. We have been very protective in the United States on trying to keep pork from areas that may have diseases out of the U.S., and what comes around goes around. And so we need to make sure that we have the ability to tell our trading partners, to assure our trading partners that the diseases that they don't want us to have when they accept our product, that we truly do have freedom disease, and that we are working to detect it at a robust enough level that if it did exist in our herd, that we would be detecting it. The other thing that has happened over the last 10 or 15 years in the swine industry, or 20, is that we seem to keep having emerging diseases, and we don't ever really get ahead of them. You know, we had PRRS virus that emerged in actually the late 80s, and we still aren't ahead of that one. Porcine circovirus associated diseases have been another one. We just keep having these things that emerge, and they get out of hand before you can stop. Now, do we have a good plan for how to stop them? We don't have that yet, but unless you have a surveillance system that picks them up earlier, it's hard to get ahead of them at all. So those were the objectives of really working to develop an integrated swine disease surveillance program. And what's involved in that is prioritizing and planning. And so I had about 8 or 10 slides in here, and when I showed it to my boss, Paul Sundberg, he said, well, maybe just your summary slides rather than to get down into the weeds too much. But we do have a planning process that looks at identifying priority diseases. One of the things that I think is very interesting is that one of the slides I pulled out of here that was written in 2007, the committee had ranked 27 swine diseases in order of importance for surveillance, and influenza didn't make the list. And it didn't make the list because it was not a disease that impacted trade, and it was a disease that was being fairly well controlled with the methods that we had on hand. So it wasn't it wasn't something that was going to be a high priority. Once we identified those priority diseases, we needed to define our surveillance objectives. So is the objective proving freedom of disease? Is it an objective of proving that there's a change in prevalence? You had to look at what is the objective of those of doing surveillance. Then, of course, you have to design the surveillance plan that's going to detect and meet those objectives. And one of the things that we turf over to NPPC, because they can go influence government, is making sure that you have adequate funding to do that surveillance. If you looked at a comprehensive approach to implementation, data gathering and analysis is key. And a lot of gathering data is been kind of siloed within surveillance programs now, because we've done program diseases instead of looking at the whole spectrum of where we might be able to gather data, and analysis, which would be largely part of what Dr. Kasari and her department would be doing out in Fort Collins. And all of this needs to be done to support decision-making processes, whether those decisions are to compartmentalize the country or to start an eradication program, or whatever the decision might be. So our current surveillance challenges, and this is again a slide from 2007, but I don't think that these challenges have changed a lot. Our current funding is tied to disease programs. So we have a pseudorabies program, and there's a brucella program, and there's this, that, and other. And it doesn't allow for priorities to be flexible. You really kind of get tied into certain silos that you have to spend that money on. And it makes it a challenge to justify surveillance dollars for current program diseases. As an example, we are officially free of pseudorabies in the commercial herd. And how much do you justify doing surveillance to keep proving freedom, and how do you prove freedom? So once we got the commercial herd free, then how do you keep justifying ongoing surveillance has been an issue. We wanted to develop an integrated and effective surveillance system independent of disease programs, but accounting for them. So we don't want to not look for pseudorabies anymore, but you want it to be able to say, can pseudorabies be part of where we pull all of our data from and include that? So the first step was to develop a plan. And we began working with the National Surveillance Unit out in Fort Collins in the summer of 2006. And doing that, they outlined the pathway to develop and communicate industry recommendations for surveillance objectives to the surveillance unit. 2006 is, it's been 4 years ago, but we've been working for over a decade on this, starting with, if you looked back at the Safeguarding Review and the Swine Futures Report, those are both major works that the industry worked with USDA to help define how important surveillance is in some of these surveillance objectives. We've also tried to look at where else can we pull data from. We have our typical slaughter surveillance that's being done. There's some other diagnostic lab data that we could get. But one of the things that Lisa Beckton's been involved in is looking at starting up the state swine health networks again. And we've been funded in the past with USDA cooperative agreement funding. And in some ways, what we'd had in the states in the past is you'd had the pseudorabies advisory committees. As states were declared free of pseudorabies, those advisory committees kind of went away. And those were people who had expertise in swine diseases. They knew where the producers were. They had relationships with, whether it was a state animal health official, to the D lab, to swine practitioners, to producers, and those committees had been pretty much disbanded. So the work has been going on to try to revive those in some of the major swine states and use them as a potential early warning system, a intelligence on emerging issues. And the expectation is that the National Surveillance Unit, the Emerging Issues Unit out at SIA, and the Checkoff Swine Health Committee would all interact with those swine health networks and get data and work together to analyze that data and develop, if needed, appropriate responses. We're also working hard, and like I said, Lisa should be up here giving this talk because she's also been very involved in setting up some sentinel veterinary clinics. And we're in the discovery phase. We were in the discovery phase in 2007. She's actually got some up and going now, and looking at having veterinary clinics in regions that can be used to do things like be not only eyes and ears, but as they mature, to perhaps be able to sample, to be able to look at a surveillance stream that we don't have now, which is healthy pigs or apparently healthy pigs on farms. We have our market. We have slaughter plants that we can sample from. You have what comes into the diagnostic labs. But apparently healthy pigs on farms, other than the NOM studies once every 6 years, there's not a lot of way to get to those. Again, the goal of those sentinel veterinary clinics is to provide data not only to the industry, but to our partners at USDA out in Fort Collins. So this is the summary slide that kind of sums up what we had done to date prior to when life changed in 2009. We developed a swine surveillance working group. They've met, I believe, at least twice, if not 3 times, and they've prioritized diseases. They've looked at providing a pathway analysis for the Swine Health Committee, the Checkoff Swine Health Committee, to review. And they actually came up with desired goals, like as an example, foot and mouth disease. They wanted a 95% confidence that we'd be able to detect a positive FMD in swine in the United States within 14 days. So they would give those types of goals and objectives, and they're prioritized. The Swine Health Committee considered costs with those priorities and provided the surveillance unit their final recommendation. And then the surveillance unit was obviously the brains on how to get it done. They're the people who are the experts on how to design a surveillance plan and how to implement it. The USDA's swine health programs and SIA would be looking at how to implement it. And obviously one of the major players in that are the non-laboratories that would receive samples from the surveillance streams. And there would also be some hope that they could analyze additional data. As an example, one of the things that we'd worked on, and I think is still going on, and Ellen can either nod yes or no, is looking at FSIS condemnation data. So if we see shifts in the numbers of animals condemned for certain reasons, and Ellen's nodding yes, you could actually say, is there something we can get ahead of? And as an example of why we've seen that that's important is we went back retrospectively, and I have to remember the year, I think it was 2001 or 2002, we had a big ear syphilis outbreak in Iowa and southern Minnesota. And quite a few condemnations. We got into trouble with having quite a few violative residues because people are trying to inject heavy hogs, keep them alive long enough to send them to market. And if you went back and looked at the FSIS condemnation data, you could have predicted that at least a couple months before it really blew up. And so those are some data that we had that can provide a lot of value and perhaps allow for a response, a real-time response. The way the system would be planned is this National Surveillance Unit would receive the data for analysis and then communicate back to industry and other stakeholders to be used in the surveillance planning process. Goal was to do this annually, and it's been done more or less annually, but it's been updated at least once that I know of. So that was in 2007. Now I've got some slides that John Korsland that works closely with Dr. Kasari has provided us on their vision of comprehensive and integrated swine surveillance. And so the goal the idea of what is and we'll call it KISS from now on out, is that it's a system that incorporates regular analysis of surveillance needs and tools. So something similar to what we just discussed on how to prioritize the diseases. And then it includes that infrastructure for collection of pertinent surveillance data at multiple effective points, or our surveillance streams. And as we mentioned, that could be slaughter, it could be diagnostic labs, it could be the sentinel networks, it could be first points in concentration. We know about the dangers of swine exhibitions and contact between pigs and people there. The system incorporates accurate planned collection of crucial disease-specific data, including time and place of activity with validated results, and an IT structure that can record and analyze collected data for action. So it's truly a comprehensive system. It's not just a collection of disease-specific surveillance plans. And as we look forward, and we'll talk a little more when we get into influenza, the goal is to say, let's say we're taking a meat juice sample at slaughter and using it to look for pseudorabies. Is that same sample also effective to be used for classical swine fever or brucellosis or agent XYZ? I mean, don't just take a sample for a disease program and throw it away and not realize or think about how else it could be used. So some of the attributes and what you can gain from it is you have this ability to gain economies of sample collection by doing multiple disease assays if justified. If we develop a surveillance system backbone, I think we can launch new surveillance activities at a lower cost. You're not rebuilding a surveillance system every time you add a new disease or have a new objective for surveillance. It provides an opportunity for multi-species surveillance when applicable, such as in vesicular diseases. And it should be scalable so that before we have a foreign animal disease outbreak, you've got something already in place that could be scaled up. And so a disease-specific surveillance information becomes a product of the comprehensive integrated surveillance, not the driver of the multiple system designs. So as we get into talking about swine influenza surveillance, you'll see that we look at that as being a product of comprehensive surveillance, not a separate system. The requirements of an effective swine disease surveillance means it needs to be pre-built, it needs to be exercised, it needs to be scalable for rapid response if there's a disaster. We can need it to be able to tie it to mass sampling, such as abattoirs. It needs to have quick turnaround, which is always difficult when we look at how strapped our labs and other data points may be. USDA access to it, industry and state support, and flexibility for endemic and emerging disease surveillance, so able to address new challenges. That is, I think, a description of the gold standard of what we would all aspire to get to. We may have some bumps in the road on the way, but that's definitely what we look at as the gold standard. This is one of the ways that the industry, and this is a chart that National Pork Board, National Pork Producers Council, and American Association of Swine Veterinarians have worked to develop. And if you look at your surveillance streams, we've got multiple surveillance streams on the top. It could be abattoirs, it could be D-lab samples, whatever. And from there, the specimens would be collected, and there will be a diagnostic lab workup. And those lab workups could be, anything from VIs to PCRs to whatever ELISA test you're going to run in serology, whatever is the appropriate tests. And then that data would go to a comprehensive comprehensive and integrated surveillance data warehouse. And we've kind of looked at saying with some of the challenges that we've had with H1N1 that there are two different audiences actually for that data now. You've got your animal health and the non-zoonotic disease data. And those include your program diseases as well as your emerging or endemic non-zoonotic diseases. You get over on the zoonotic side and you have influenza that's proven to be more zoonotic than not. We always knew it was kind of a zoonosis of sorts. We just got one this time that's real zoonotic. And I don't know if that's kind of like being kind of pregnant, but... and then, of course, things like other foodborne diseases like trichina, toxo, you might have salmonella on both sides because it could be an animal health issue as well as a zoonotic disease issue. And in those cases, in many cases, public health is going to want to have access to that data as well. They're going to want to know what's happening. And we'll talk more about the swine influenza as an example. So, history of SIV surveillance, we're going to talk a little bit prior to April 2009 and currently what's going on, as well as I'm going to touch briefly on proposals that we've got under discussion. Actually, it's very interesting. Prior to 2009, we had an SIV surveillance of sorts that was individual producer and practitioner driven and funded. It was conducted by a handful of diagnostic labs. There's probably just a few that really do a lot of VI as well as PCR and then sequencing of influenza viruses. It was, most of them sequenced just a portion of the HA gene, and because it's such a small portion, 800 to 1,000 base pairs, that data was seldom submitted to GenBank. So as you got into after April last year, you had a lot of people saying there's no swine surveillance. This is probably novel H1N1 is probably rampant in the swine herd, and we don't have anything in GenBank to tell us why it's not there. And like I said, because it's a portion of the HA gene, GenBank considered those either low quality or not desirable submissions to GenBank. The reason people were doing this, it was an aid in disease control on the farm, and also there's a large number of the animals that are vaccinated for swine influenza are vaccinated with autogenous vaccines. So you could check your vaccine virus that you were using to make autogenous against new viruses that you had identified in your system and see how close your match was for vaccine. It was surprisingly robust. When you went back and looked retrospectively to say how many viruses are out there in databases, how many sequences do we have, how can we determine whether novel H1N1 had ever been in the U.S. prior to April when it came in people, there was a lot of data out there. This is a graphic that was provided to me by Amy Vincent, and if you look at the data that she had to look at even developing the emergence of novel H1N1 along that timeline, most of the sequence data that is derived there to be able to put this on the timeline came out of what was a voluntary diagnostic lab surveillance data. And it was, like I said, surprisingly robust. It also had some issues in that it wasn't publicly available. It was controlled by a small number of universities who were excellent in aggregating and sharing their data. But from the outside looking in, it looked like it was private, super secret database that existed somewhere. In 2008, there was a memorandum of understanding between CDC and USDA to look at a pilot project for swine influenza surveillance. And there were several developmental meetings and telephone calls to set it up. And I may have missed somebody. In fact, I can see right now I don't have SIA on here from USDA. We had NVSL, Vet Services, NALN, ARS, Center for Veterinary Biologics, National Surveillance Unit actually hosted a meeting, so it's not like they were integral in this development of this program. From CDC's point of view, what was SVED, which is there's zoonotic and vector-borne enteric diseases that's now been renamed in the last few months, was involved, as well as the influenza branch. And from industry, even though industry wasn't part of the Memorandum of Understanding, NPPC, the Pork Board, and ASV were all involved in and committed to trying to make this pilot project a viable one. And we were really ready to go in April 2009. We'd actually been at CDC on April 1st and 2nd. We had done some tabletop drills. Things were just about ready to get up and get going. Some of the pilot project objectives were that we needed a communications plan for human cases of SIV. So what happens in those cases where a state health department says we've got a human that's diagnosed with swine influenza, how do you communicate and how do you respond? We wanted to improve diagnostic reagents, keep them up to date, both from NVSL, and as we look further down, CDC also wanted to be able to have the ability to make reagents in case something that they needed to have tests up and going in case this moved into humans. CVB would talked about improved vaccines. Is there a way to follow the human model and update vaccines regularly? And one of the big objectives, and I think was one that was probably very well met, was new working partnerships between animal agriculture, USDA, and CDC. If we had not been working on this and April 24th had hit, and nobody knew each other's names or faces or telephone numbers or who did what and whom to call, it would have been a lot rockier than it was come April. This is just an example of why the pilot program had been launched. This is an article that actually was published in June of 2009, but it talked about, I think in this one, 13 different cases of human infections with our triple reassortant swine influenza virus. Very much a zoonotic transmission came there was in most cases pig contact. And in fact, what was very interesting is actually during the height of the outbreak, I believe it was in June, we in Minnesota had word that, oh, it's going to happen. We've got this person that's been diagnosed with novel H1N1. She works in a barn, but pigs are all sick in the barn. We're going to go out and sample it. Well, it turns out that she was the 14th case of a triple reassortant H1 in humans. She had a regular old swine triple reassortant. The tests that they're using in the human laboratories just picked her up as a non-human H1. And so they automatically thought she was a novel H1N1. She wasn't, but those are the sorts of communications trees we needed. So when that whole thing happened, we were able to work and be ready. I mean, we had a communications plan in place. In the pilot, and you're going to see this again later, there was 3 surveillance streams. Those were pigs that were epi-linked with sick people. And by sick people, we mean at that point it was people that had been diagnosed with a swine influenza infection. Sick pigs at first points of concentration, such as exhibitions or buying stations, and then case-compatible diagnostic submissions. And those diagnostic submissions would be looking at respiratory diagnostic submissions to non-labs. I guess I spelled non-lab wrong. That should be an N, not an S, that were eligible. And what we were looking at that time, because there's a limited budget, was unusual clinical presentations. So whether it was high mortality, an unusual age group, disease in a herd that had previously been successfully vaccinated. And so one of the things we had pushed for, and the budget wasn't there for that program, but I think it'll be here in the future, is a certain number of normal flus. So we were just picking out unusuals here, and also untypables would also fit into the unusuals, but it's hard to know what's unusual when you didn't have a good feel of what was normal. So I think that as we go forward, having some baseline of what is the normal flus out there will be really valuable. Typing would happen at the non-laboratory. Untypables would go to NVSL. And if there was a need on some of these unusual ones to actually do full sequencing, that would be done at NADC. The veterinary practitioner was going to flag the submission as something unusual, or it might say something on his submission form that says, you know, I've got 20% mortality or something that would flag it, and request participation, or the D-Lab if they saw somebody, you know, as you looked at that and said, this looks weird in what we're seeing in the submission, they could go back and request or contact the practitioner and request them entering the program. And the result, the payment back would be that the practitioner would receive credit on diagnostic submissions for isolates used in the program, and they would receive the sequence information from those isolates that were also used in the program. We sold this to our swine health committee, and it was a pretty easy sell. Well, there was a lot of discussion, but it was still a pretty easy sell. What we looked at is the benefit for swine health was it was going to have the potential to improve understanding of the epidemiology of SIV, our current strains, and looking at any new strains entering the U.S. herd. We had the potential to improve diagnostics through updating reagents supplied by NVSL. We had the potential to improve vaccines by updating viruses and commercial vaccines. And we have the potential to share technologies and learnings between human and veterinary channels. And I think that's something that we're still going on. As an example, with our Sentinel veterinary clinics, CDC has been using Sentinel influenza human providers for many years. So what can we learn from those new partners who've been doing some of these things a lot longer than we have? April 2009 changed one or two things in the life of most of us that work with pigs. It was never a good day when you start seeing your species tied to things like armies walking the streets with masks on, when you have the popular press talking about that the outbreak is linked to factory farms, and you're already criticized for having an industry full of factory farms. And you know, the ability to get in front of the name swine flu was impossible. We started on April 25th with CDC on some of those early calls before there was any much press yet, questioning that name, and it just, once it got out there, it was impossible to pull back. What's been the result? These are Dr. Steve Myers, who's an economist with Paragon Economics. This is his November data. We actually have come ahead of above baseline a little quicker than expected, but in the first, from basically up until November, we lost $1.5 billion, B with a billion with a B, through the industry. Projected losses are going to be somewhere about $1.75 to $2 billion of equity and losses above what had been predicted, that the futures had predicted. A lot of that is not because consumers stopped eating pork. We had about a week when it first hit that there was some soft sales in the grocery stores, but then actually domestic consumption of pork per capita rose last year. Now, part of the reason it rose is pork was darn cheap. I mean, you can go buy loins for 99 cents a pound. It's a pretty good buy. What we lost was export markets. You know, our trading partners got pretty nervous. We have some of the Canadian pork producers here who suffered the same sorts of losses that we did through this. And because we're a commodity and speculation market, the commodity traders just said, this is going to be a huge disaster. And the futures market just fell apart. It just fell apart. And it took forever to get it back. And so there was probably a lot of loss that was not in any way based on reality. And in addition to that, we had probably more pigs than we needed on the market. So it was an oversupply of pigs with a whole lot of bad news about H1N1. So that leads us to how are we going to find out if we've got it in the U.S. herd? How are we going to find out how widespread it is? What do we do when we find it? So our current surveillance program that is USDA and state-run, is currently limited in participation due to concern over response to positive findings. We have very few veterinarians and producers that are submitting samples for sequencing to the D-Labs, or typing and sequencing. They may get to an influenza A, but they're not going to ask for sequencing. And it's really unfortunate because the response to positive herds to date has been appropriate, and it's had little to no negative effects on either the herds or the industry. But there is still, after the shock of what happened last summer, spring and summer, there's a lot of producers and a lot of veterinarians who just don't want to take an iota of chance. As we look at surveillance for novel H1N1, a lot of the program's been designed to focus on identifying novel H1N1, and I think it's going to be a really valuable program when we keep working on shifting to being more comprehensive. Let's look at what we've got out there for influenzas, all influenzas, what's changing, has novel H1N1 replaced our other H1N1s. So when we can really get the big picture. But what we do see is that the H1N1 funds that would set aside to go to USDA are going to provide an opportunity to build a valuable surveillance program for all swine diseases and influenza subtypes. We would love to be able to work on getting that comprehensive surveillance program up and going with swine influenza as one of the products of that program, of that surveillance program, and be able to use this opportunity to get something good out of what was a really bad situation. And this is just really simplistic, and this has just my idea. We start out with sample collection and submission. It's tested in a non-laboratory. It's confirmed at NVSL if it's a suspect. State animal health officials probably come in a little earlier in the circle. But you report it up to USDA, state animal health officials. The first positive was reported to OIE, and then USDA tells us they'll aggregate reports and do them twice a year, I believe. And then you've got a response that's been largely in the hands of the state animal health official, although USDA had developed guidance. We'd worried about public health response and had worked very hard with CDC and the National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians to say, they pretty much backed off. They pretty much have left it as an animal health response, and worried very much about what our customers would say. Are the Walmarts of the world going to call the Hormels of the world and say, we hear there's positive pigs in Minnesota, we want to make sure you're not sending us pigs from any of those farms? That has not happened. We've got, you might look at this as being familiar. We have the same 3 surveillance streams as we had in the pilot program. The one thing that is an absolute right now is that the producer and the veterinarian need to opt into the surveillance program. There's been a checkbox on most of the diagnostic lab submissions that say, I will check this box that says I want to be part of the surveillance program. Not very many people are getting carpal tunnel disease checking those boxes. And we see some of the same benefits. Swine influenza surveillance has benefits for both human and animal health. If we better understand the epidemiology of influenza in the swine herd and really help start controlling it, it's going to be a big financial incentive for the swine industry. Swine influenza is an endemic disease that causes sickness in pigs. It causes production losses, and we haven't had the best handle on how to control it. Developing more accurate diagnostic reagents. When we talk to CDC, they've told us that their goal of this program is that they want access to these viruses that might be unusual, might be emerging, so that they can develop diagnostic reagents, so in case they need to start getting them out to their sentinel networks to look for a unique strain that might be entering the human population, they've got those reagents up and going. And they'd also like to be able to have master seeds develop in the case that it looks like they might need to have vaccine development happen. So, getting ahead by having those isolates to them before it hits the fan. If they'd had a master seed, which would have been hard to have because we didn't have it in the, hadn't been able to find it in the U.S., but if you'd had a master seed produced 2 or 3 months earlier, it would have made a huge difference in this last round. Response to positives has been on a state-to-state basis. It's been, the state animal health officials have been very reasonable. There's been a couple states that have had positives that have had press releases. They've worked with the herd veterinarian to say, as long as pigs are sick, let's not move them. Once they're healthy again and not showing clinical designs, they're free to move. USDA has a website where they post the presumptive and confirmed positives. I don't know that very many people look at it, and I'm pretty sure the AP and Reuters and all of the media outlets never go there. I mean, I don't think they realize we're up to, I think, 6 or 7 states and several herds that have been confirmed positive. We do know that there is, among the people, detractors of modern agriculture, lack of surveillance has raised questions. And so this is just an example. If you're familiar with environmental health perspectives, a lot of the faculty from Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, which have had a very negative attitude toward confinement or large-scale production systems, publish in here. And this issue was early on. It was September, but by the time you get into a peer-reviewed journal, September's pretty quick when things happen in April. Definitely started raising questions about what's the industry hiding, what's happening, why are you not doing surveillance? So what we've worked very hard at is, as an industry, trying to say, how do we get value out of this? And trying to work very hard with the surveillance, or with the stakeholders. So here's a list, and I probably again have forgotten to put people on this list of stakeholders, of people who have to, as a program is developed and put into implementation, that are all going to be involved. They're going to be the people who are on, the feet on the street and doing things, and what happens in the labs and all of that stuff. What we want to do affects all of the day-to-day business of a lot of these people. As an industry with both NPPC, Pork Board, as well as ASV, we have looked at perhaps an incremental program where, to get surveillance up and going, can we guarantee anonymity to the producers and the veterinarians that are submitting samples. It's a point of discussion, and we're working with our partners in government as well as industry to say, is that going to be something we can do? So when Lanny had called, I said, I think things are moving pretty good. We'll probably be able to tell you more about the plan. I can tell you right now that it's under discussion. I think everybody, of all of those stakeholders, is committed to trying to do what we can to get a robust swine influenza surveillance up and going. So our next steps are to continue to work and design and implement a system that benefits both animal health and public health. This has been, I think, a perfect example of One Health. There is no animal health versus public health in this. It's we're all equally sitting at the table, and to continue to work and to continue to stress that we have to have open and transparent communication throughout the pork chain, and that goes all the way from the producer all the way through to whether it's Dr. Clifford or the Secretary of Agriculture or the Secretary of the Health and Human Services.